The Federal Reserve does not have to announce that it lost control for you to feel it. You feel it when gas jumps again. You feel it when groceries rise even though you were promised inflation was getting better. You feel it when the market sells off on one headline and rallies on the next, as if the entire financial system has become a nervous animal. And you feel it most of all when the people in charge of money start sounding like they are trying to solve three different problems with one lever that no longer reaches all three. That is where I want to begin, not with the Middle East, not with the newest attack, not with another lazy television segment about why oil moved today. I want to begin with the deeper issue. The Federal Reserve is now being pulled in opposite directions by inflation, economic weakness, and the credibility of the dollar itself. That is the real story. The oil spike is not the story. It is the trigger that reveals the story, because once oil begins rising into a slowing economy, the Fed does not get a clean problem anymore. It gets a contradiction. And contradictions are where central banks stop looking powerful. The public still imagines the Federal Reserve as a kind of machine with two clean buttons. Inflation is too high, raise rates, growth is too weak, cut rates. That story is now far too simple. Higher oil prices do not just make one corner of life more expensive. They enter the bloodstream of the economy. Gas gets more expensive, diesel gets more expensive, shipping gets more expensive, fertilizer gets more expensive, food gets more expensive, airlines feel it, trucking feels it, margins feel it, consumers feel it everywhere. And this is the first thing most people miss. Oil is not one line item. Oil is a pressure multiplier. That is why the Fed cannot dismiss it even if it wants to. When energy costs rise hard enough, they start forcing bad choices on everybody else. The worker has less room, the family has less room, the retailer has less room, the restaurant has less room, and the economy that runs on spending starts breathing shallower than it was before. That is the first mechanism I want you to understand. The squeeze mechanism. A higher cost of living does not destroy demand all at once. It starves it. One bowl skipped, one trip postponed, one purchase delayed, one credit card swipe added, one more month of saying maybe later. That is how consumer slowdowns actually happen. Not with a dramatic bell, with thousands of tiny retreats from everyday spending. And because the American economy lives so heavily on consumption, that matters far more than people want to admit. If households are already stretched and then oil forces up the price of the basics, the problem is not just that life feels worse. The problem is that the engine of the economy loses discretionary fuel. The more a person spends on gas, food, utilities, and essentials, the less he spends on everything else. That is how the squeeze starts climbing up into earnings, hiring, and eventually equity prices. Now let me connect that to the Fed, because that is where the source material you gave me becomes more valuable than the average market headline. The public still thinks the Fed faces one problem at a time, but when energy drives inflation higher while growth is already softening, the Fed gets trapped between incompatible objectives. If it cuts rates aggressively, it may support the economy, but it also risks validating higher inflation and weakening confidence in the dollar. If it raises rates or stays too tight, it may defend the currency and lean against inflation, but it also deepens the growth slowdown and increases the strain on debtors, housing, and credit. That is not a clean trade-off. That is a policy split. And a split is exactly what the Fed is now showing the public. The meeting at the end of April was important not because rates moved dramatically. They did not. It was important because disagreement became visible. The Fed held rates steady in the 3.5% to 3.75% range. But the dissents were unusually large, the largest in decades according to Reuters. That matters because a central bank derives part of its power from appearing coherent even when it is not. Once the internal argument becomes too visible, the market stops seeing one institution and starts seeing factions. Faysite, Fayturn 534,656 search, 7 Fayturn 534,656 search 0 Fay. That is the second mechanism. The division mechanism, a divided Fed is not dangerous only because the members disagree. It is dangerous because markets start to realize that the institution may no longer have one dominant theory of what the bigger problem is. Is the bigger problem inflation? Is it growth? Is it the debt burden? Is it the dollar? Is it political pressure? When the answer becomes all of the above, you no longer have elegant policy, you have triage. And triage is what people are actually watching now, whether they know it or not. One wing of the Fed sees a slowing economy and wants relief. Another wing sees inflation reaccelerating and wants restraint. And both sides are looking at the same oil shock and reading different implications from it. That is why this moment matters so much. Because once the people in charge of money are not even sure which fire matters most, the public starts living in a world where every policy choice solves one problem by worsening another. That is what the Fed has really lost. Not power in the abstract simplicity. And when a central bank loses simplicity, it also starts losing the illusion of control. Now let us talk about inflation directly, because this is where people often get manipulated by presentation. The Fed's preferred measure has been reaccelerating. Energy is rising. Food pressure is rising. And the metric the Fed prefers to emphasize, PCE, already strips out some of the categories ordinary people feel most directly. That means there is often a psychological gap between what the Fed says it is watching and what the public feels with their own eyes. That gap is politically dangerous. A family does not care whether inflation is transitory, core, non-core, trimmed, or median if the monthly bill keeps getting heavier. A family cares that the paycheck stops stretching. That is the third mechanism, the trust gap. When official inflation language drifts too far from lived inflation reality, people stop trusting the institution's description of the problem, even if the institution still controls the interest rate tool. That matters because central banking is not just math, it is theater plus math, confidence plus math, belief plus math. If enough people stop believing the institution is naming the problem, honestly, its guidance loses moral force, even before it loses technical force. That is what I think we are starting to see. Now, let me bring in the leadership question, because this is the part the market hates most. Jerome Powell's term as chair ends on May 15, and Kevin Warsh is set to take over. Powell has said he will remain on the Board of Governors for now, which already makes the transition unusual. Warsh arrives not into a calm handoff, but into a fractured committee, a hotter inflation backdrop, and enormous political expectations from President Trump, who wants lower rates. Faysite Fayturn 534,656 search, 0 Fayturn 534,656 search, 1 Fayturn 534,656, News 41 Fay. This is the fourth mechanism, the regime shift mechanism. Markets do not only price what the current policy is, they price how much the regime itself might change. Warsh matters not because one person magically controls everything. The FOMC is still a committee. But leadership changes the center of gravity. Language changes, communication changes, tolerance for inflation changes, tolerance for dissent changes. The whole emotional weather of policy can change. And because Warsh is widely associated with a more political, more aggressive, more openly anti-Powell reset, the transition itself creates uncertainty even before the first policy move under him has happened. That is why the market gets nervous. Not because it knows exactly what he will do, because it knows he might do something meaningfully different while the institution is already divided. That is a very hard thing to price if you are a stock investor and you are trying to model long-duration cash flows. A messy handoff at the Fed is not your friend. If you are a bond investor and you are trying to decide whether inflation will be tolerated more or less from here, a messy handoff is not your friend either. If you are an ordinary person with debt savings and a paycheck, it matters too, because the future path of rates changes the cost of everything from mortgages to credit card balances to job growth. This is why I keep saying this is not just a Wall Street story, it is a household story. Now, there is another piece almost nobody wants to talk about directly, but it is sitting underneath all of this. The dollar, the Fed does not officially say it has a third mandate. But in a world of high inflation, high debt, higher oil, and rising geopolitical tension, defending the credibility of the dollar becomes an unspoken policy concern, whether policymakers like the wording or not. This is what many people miss. The Fed does not operate in a vacuum where it can purely optimize unemployment and consumer prices while ignoring the credibility of the unit itself. When inflation runs too hot, the dollar's purchasing power takes the hit. When foreign buyers demand more compensation to hold dollar-denominated debt, long yields rise. When oil and commodities rise into that backdrop, the problem gets worse. And if the market begins to think the Fed will choose growth stimulus over inflation discipline at exactly the wrong moment, confidence in the currency gets thinner. That is the fifth mechanism, the credibility squeeze. A central bank can help the economy. A central bank can help debtors. A central bank can sometimes support risk assets, but it can only do those things for so long before the market starts asking whether the cost will be paid in currency weakness and higher inflation later. That is why saving the economy and saving the dollar increasingly feel like opposite missions. The old world assumed the Fed could usually rescue both eventually. This new world is asking whether that era is over. That is what people are sensing. Not just the oil spike, not just the Fed split, a deeper change in the nature of the trade-offs. Now, once you understand that, the stock market starts making more sense. People often ask why markets can fall so violently on bad inflation or energy news, then rally violently on some other headline days later, because the market is not a moral machine. It is a discounting machine trapped inside a narrative machine. It is constantly trying to front-run what the Fed might do, what growth might do, what inflation might do, and what policymakers might panic about next. When the Fed looked likely to print massively in 2020, markets exploded higher after the crash. When Trump announced tariffs and then paused them, markets swung violently. When the Middle East conflict escalated and then seemed to cool temporarily, markets swung again. This is not the market being irrational, in some childish sense. This is the market constantly repricing policy expectations and liquidity conditions faster than ordinary people can emotionally process them. That is why I want you to stop looking at volatility as a sign the world is ending. Volatility is the surface language of uncertainty. The more uncertain the policy path, the more violent the price path tends to become. That is normal. The sixth mechanism is the liquidity reflex. Markets today are conditioned by the memory that every serious scare eventually brought some combination of policy relief, fiscal relief, or a change in the narrative big enough to trigger buying. That reflex matters. It means every decline is now interpreted through two competing lenses. One lens says, this is the start of something worse. The other says, this will become a buying opportunity because somebody in power will blink. That is one reason dips can get bought so quickly, even when the underlying macro situation still looks ugly. People are no longer just pricing fundamentals. They are pricing the probability of rescue. That does not mean rescue always comes. It means the expectation of rescue changes behavior, and that is exactly why buying opportunities can appear when fear gets too loud. I want to be very clear here. I am not saying every decline must be bought blindly. I am saying you have to know what you want to own before fear arrives. That is where most people fail. They wait until the sell-off begins, then they become emotional, then they start asking what to buy after the pain already made them stupid. That is backward. A real investor builds the list first. He knows which businesses, which ETFs, which industries, which prices, and which balance sheet profiles he respects before the market gives him a discount. Then, when volatility hits, he is not inventing a plan. He is executing one. That is the difference between using a downturn and being used by it. I cannot tell you exactly when the next recession will hit. I cannot tell you if oil keeps climbing for 6 months or if the conflict cools faster than expected. I cannot tell you whether Warsh will cut aggressively, surprise hawkishly, or move in some hybrid direction. Once he takes the chair, nobody honest can. What I can tell you is that the environment has changed. The Fed is more divided. Inflation is less cooperative. Oil is more dangerous. The dollar is more sensitive. And that means markets are more fragile to narrative shocks than people want to admit. But fragility is not the same thing as hopelessness. This is where most people become amateurs. They hear risk and assume the answer is paralysis. Number risk means you get your money right. Risk means you reduce the part of your life that depends on perfect macro outcomes. Risk means you build cash reserves. Risk means you know what you will buy if the market falls. Risk means you stop pretending you will somehow ring the bell at the exact bottom, because you will not. No one does. The people who build wealth in sell-offs are not the people who perfectly predicted the last red candle. They are the people who knew what they wanted, kept capital available, and bought in phases while the world was still yelling. That is the seventh mechanism. The anti-panic mechanism, when you automate part of your investing, or when you know you are buying in stages on the way down. You free yourself from the most expensive fantasy in investing, the fantasy that there will be a clean, obvious, emotionally comfortable bottom. There will not be. By the time the bottom feels safe, much of the opportunity is already gone. That is why I always tell people to think like an owner, not a gambler. A gambler wants the perfect day. An owner wants good assets at better prices. Those are very different mindsets. This is why I get frustrated when people hear a story like this and conclude, so I should just wait. Wait for what? Wait for certainty. Wait for the headlines to stop being ugly. Wait for the Fed to become unified again. Wait for inflation to politely return to target while oil magically falls, the economy stabilizes, and rates become obviously supportive all at once. That world may never come. And if it does, the best prices will not survive long enough for you to enjoy them. That is not how markets work. This is the lesson I learned most clearly in 2020, and it is the lesson I keep seeing every time markets go through a violent policy-driven scare. The people who scream the loudest about the end usually do the least. They confuse fear with insight. They think waiting for collapse is discipline. Usually it is just delayed regret. That does not mean you buy recklessly. It means you buy rationally. Own what you understand. Add when prices improve. Stay within your liquidity limits. Do not use money you need next month. Do not pretend a falling stock is automatically a bargain, but do not run away from volatility either. Volatility is where the better entry points come from, and this current environment is almost guaranteed to create more of it. That is why I think the smartest response to this Fed story is not panic. It is preparation. You get your cash flow right. You reduce dumb debt where you can. You stop assuming the Fed will make your life easy. You build a repeatable investing system. You decide in advance what qualifies as a great business for your portfolio. And then, when the conflict in the Middle East, the inflation pressure, or the next ugly Fed headline creates another wave of selling, you are in position to do what serious capital always does. Buy what the frightened are throwing away. That is not a slogan. That is the actual work of wealth building, because the irony of this whole moment is simple. The Fed may indeed have lost control of the clean story. It may no longer be able to tell one simple, coherent tale about how it will save growth, save the dollar, and kill inflation all at once. That part may be gone. But you do not need the Fed to restore simplicity before you can act intelligently. You just need to understand the new world more clearly than the average person does. The new world says inflation can reaccelerate. Suddenly the new world says oil shocks matter. The new world says central banks can be divided. The new world says leadership transitions matter. The new world says policy uncertainty creates volatility. And the new world says volatility used correctly is not your enemy. It is your discount mechanism. That is how I want you to think. Not everything is broken. But the old certainty is broken, so my system must be stronger. That is a much more useful conclusion. And frankly, it is probably the only adult way to live through a period like this, because what comes next may not be clean. Warsh may cut faster than expected. He may surprise people by trying to restore some anti-inflation credibility. The Fed may fracture more. The economy may soften further. Oil may ease or explode. The point is not to know. The point is to prepare, and the people who prepare while everybody else is still arguing about the headlines are the ones who usually come out of these periods richer, calmer, and harder to break than they were before. That is why I do not think the most important question is whether the Fed lost control. I think the more important question is whether you are still building your financial life as if the Fed still had the kind of control people once imagined it did. If you are, that is the real risk, because that world is gone, and the faster you admit it, the better you can build for the one we actually have.